Namaskar. We have started the free classes of soil science. I have already covered soil science lecture 1 and lecture 2 where I have discussed about the some introductory part, and then I have discussed the rocks and minerals. Now today I am going to talk about one important point called weathering and soil formation. I am Arko Pravodhikari. I have made this video in Hindi language too, so you can watch that if you are comfortable with Hindi language. So basically whenever we eat a bread that has the complex carbohydrates, and that complex carbohydrates actually break down into small parts as simple monomers by the enzyme, then we are able to absorb that in our stomach. So it is happening also in case of soil formation. So you can see the complex parts are actually break down into smaller parts. So here also the rock which having the everything, minerals and everything in a solid manner, then it is actually break down by the process called as the weathering, which is actually a bunch of events like rain, thunder, temperature, frost, microbes and many other things, and then we get the soil. So this whole process is actually called as the weathering. So weathering can be three type, like the physical weathering, it can be chemical weathering, and it can be biological weathering. So we will discuss each of them. First of all, we are talking about the physical weathering. Whenever we will learn the weathering, we have to remember the agents. There are some agents which actually undergoing this weathering. In case of physical weathering, the agents are the temperature, water, air and animal and plant. What they do, they actually break down these solid particles, the solid rocks into small pieces, fragmented pieces, which will convert them into regolith. Then some soil factor will work, and then it will be converted into the true soil. So here you have to remember that in case of physical weathering, there is no change in chemical structure, because we are not undergoing any chemical reaction. We are just breaking down the huge particles into very small fragmented particles. In case of chemical weathering, this chemical weathering actually done by many things, like the plant itself, the root exudates from them, the microorganisms involving chemical reaction. So basically what is happening here, the chemical reaction is happening, and this chemical reaction can be hydration, hydrolysis, oxidation, reduction. And here you have to remember that this is the most important weathering happening in nature. The chemical weathering is the most important weathering. Now we are talking about the biological weathering. The biological weathering, the agents are nothing but the microorganisms and plants. How microorganisms and plants are contributing in the weathering? The microorganisms produce chemical substances, and that chemical substances break down these hard particles into very small particles. Or you can see the particle which is actually break down by the physical and chemical weathering. Those particles can be further loosened, further fragmented by this biological weathering, by these microorganisms producing those chemical substances. In case of plants, they whenever they want to penetrate their root or expand their root, those roots are too much, those roots actually create too much pressure, by which these particles get fragmented, and that is actually called as the biological weathering, because plants are biological units. So here you can see the weakening and disintegration of rocks is happening. So you have to remember that the most important weathering is the chemical weathering. Among these three weathering, most important is the chemical weathering. Now we have to remember the chemical composition of the soil. Why we are talking about the chemical composition? I have told that rock is forming the soil. That means the soil has some minerals, because rock are the source of the minerals. So soil has the one portion where we can find a majority portion where we can find the minerals, and that minerals, how much percent mineral are there and how much percent other things are there, that's the composition. In case of soil composition, you can see there are 45% minerals, 25% air and water, and 5% organic matter. That 45% minerals are actually differ from soil to soil, because the rocks make the soil, and from which rock which soil have generated, that determine their mineral quality. Suppose there is a rock which has the major portion of the gypsum. So gypsum has the calcium and sulfur. So after the withering of that rock, the soil formed from this rock will have the high concentration of calcium and sulfur. High concentration of calcium and sulfur. That's the difference of other soil which is forming from the other rock. So that 45% is fixed, but the quality of that 45% differs from the rock wise. So we are talking about the organic matter. This 5% organic matter can be subdivided with this, that the 47% are humus, 39% are roots, and 14% are organisms. So this is the composition of soil. Now before further going to this video, I want to tell you that there's the change is in the examination pattern, like that there is change is the question pattern, as now majority of the exams like ICRS, JRF, SRF, CUET, BHU, PET, and many other exams like state PG, they are actually following the trend of the NTA, the National Testing Agency. So National Testing Agency are asking the question which are actually basically the conceptual question, assertion reason question, and statement type question, match the column type question. So for that we have to prepare some in that way. We have to prepare according to their strategy. So whenever we go for any exam, we first pick up the Nemraj, Sunda, then we go for the Arun Katyayan. So these two books is very much important. That's why we have made the detailed test series having the question pattern of the just like the NTA. And there are many state or state PG exam where we can find that the majority of the question are from the just the Nemraj, Sunda. So in this test series you will get the validity of 1 year. The validity will be till the 2023 IBPS AFO. You can do unlimited attempt. You can do the test anytime. You can use any device, laptop or Android or iOS, Mac, anything. So you can see there in this Nemraj, Sunda, Arun Katyayan test series, the arrangement of the test are just like the book's chapter sequence. You can see in the Arun Katyayan the chapters are arranged like chapter 4 crop ecology, chapter 5 dryland agriculture, chapter 6 and 7 erosion and soil conservation. So we have just made the test in that way. We have arranged in such a way that it will help you just read the chapter and practice the question from that chapter having the NTA question pattern. So you can see we have included conceptual question, assertion reason question, match the column question, and statement type question. I have attached the registration link in the description box. You can check that. So now back to the class. We are going to talk about the soil formation. Now we have discussed the withering. So there is some factors responsible for the soil formation, and these factors differ from the scientist to scientist. Now the most important two scientists are the Joffy and Henry. Now we are going to talk about the Joffy's soil factors. He divided this into the two part called as the active factor and the passive factor. In case of active factor, he mentioned the climate and organism as the active factor, and in case of passive factors, he meant the parent material and topography and time as the passive factor. Now we are moving to the second most important by the Jenny, that the active factors are the same as the previous one, climate and organisms, and the passive factors, it took down this time from the passive factor and made the separate factor called as the neutral factor. So here in case of passive factor we are getting the parent material, then topography, and in case of neutral factor you are getting the time. Okay. So as I have discussed that there are the three passive factors, parent material, topography and time. So I will discuss each of them in a brief way. The parent material is nothing but the mass from which soil has formed. Okay, now parent material are divided into two parts, that is the consolidated and unconsolidated. In case of consolidated, we can say the igneous rock, sedimentary rock, metamorphic rock, those are consolidated, but the alluvial and collovial, those are the unconsolidated parent material. So you have to remember this, that there are two parts, two type, consolidated and unconsolidated, and this parent material are the chief constituent of the soil which is actually forming the soil. That is the parent material. Now we are going to talk about the topography, the second passive factor. Now topography actually linked with the slope of the land. Now in case of flat, there is the 0% of the slope, so topography is the 0%. In case of undulating land, the topography, the slope varies from 5 to 10. If the slope is 10 to 15%, that will be called as the rolling land, rolling topography. If the slope is 15 to 30%, that topography will be called as the hilly topography. And in case of mountain, the percentage of slope is more than 30%. So this is the basic principle of the topography. Now we are going to talk about the time, because why time is important, that the weathering process is not fast, it takes time. It first starts, then undergoes some stages, and then ends. So this time duration is actually divided into some 5 to 6 part, and those times are: the first is the initiation stage, second juvenile stage, third virile stage, fourth senile stage, and then the final stage. What happens in this initial stage is that then the rocks are become unwithered. The withering process has not started. Now when the withering process is start, that time is called as the juvenile stage. And after that, after some time, that withering actually undergoes the decomposition, when the rocks are actually fragmented in smaller particles, and that stage is called as the virile stage. After the virile stage, the senile stage comes, when the majority of the rocks constituent actually divided, and those particles which are still not withered are the resistant to withering, and that will take more time to be withered. But we call that senile stage because the majority of the soil, majority of the constituent of the rock is degenerated, is decomposed. Now after the degeneration of the total rock, the final stage comes when the withering is completed. Okay, so this is the time, this is the 5 stages, and that's why the time is actually called as the passive factors. Now we are going to talk about some important terminologies, because from this part mainly the terminologies are asked in the exam, and that's why this part is important, and we have to study this very efficiently. First is the regolith. What is the difference between the regolith and the true soil? Now we know that rock actually after the withering it forms some particle that is actually called as the regolith, and that regolith will convert it into true soil under the influence of some soil forming factor. So you have to remember that the rock first get withered, and the product they produce are called as the regolith. And from that regolith, when soil forming factors work on that regolith, that will be converted into true soil. So this is the definition of the regolith. Now you can describe it in according to your own language. Now we are going to talk about other important factor, that is called as the other important terminology, humification. Humification is nothing but the accumulation of organic matter. This is the accumulation of organic matter. Okay. Now moving to the one important terminology is the alluviation. Now alluviation and illuviation both are important, because the alluviation is actually related to the soil horizon A2. Okay, so this is actually washing out of the minerals. We can see the mobilization of the minerals, or we can see the leaching of the minerals. This is called as the alluviation, and this is actually happening in the A2 horizon. Now its opposite is the accumulation or washing in, and that is called as the illuviation. In case of illuviation, the washing in or accumulation of the mineral happens, and that happens in the B2 horizon of the soil profile. Now the next terminology is the calcification and decalcification. From the name we can see that calcification means the accumulation of the calcium, and that is in the form of CaCO3, and the opposite is the decalcification. Now the next terminology is one of the important terminology, that's a laterization. And laterization is important and its opposite is also important. In case of laterization, what happens, the silicon leaching is happening. Silicon does leach, and whenever silicon leaches, the accumulation of the iron and aluminum oxide happens. So this process is called as the laterization, and this happens in the warm and humid climate. Its opposite is the podzolization, where we can see the accumulation of the silicon happens, and the opposite, and whenever there is the accumulation of the silicon, there will be the leaching of iron and aluminum oxides, and this is happening in the cold and humid region. So podzolization and laterization is just opposite. You just remember the laterization is actually the leaching of the silicon, and you remember that whenever there is the leaching of the silicon, there is the accumulation of some oxide by the iron or aluminum. Perturrbation is nothing but the mixing of the soil, and it happens by the plants or animals or microorganisms. So I have discussed the third lecture here, the introduction, then the rock and mineral, then the soil formation and weathering. In the next lecture, I will discuss about the soil profile. So stay tuned for that video, and please subscribe to our channel, and please share this video if you found important and beneficial for you. Thank you.